Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Friday Coffee Meetup. I am Christy Connor, your host. Friday Coffee Meetup is the largest active innovation, entrepreneurial, and tech meetup in Los Angeles, California. We are here to promote innovation and build community in the Southern California area. Starting in February, we'll start meeting on the first and third Fridays of every month. Today, I'm so thrilled. We have one of my favorite artists here. He is an artist, a scientist, and an author, Enrique Martínez Celaya. I've been counting down to this day for a few months now. Who gets to meet their favorite artist? I am today. So I'm thrilled, but before we introduce him, I would also like to say a few thank yous and go over some logistical items for today's event. Although you are seeing my face right now, there's a whole host of people behind the scenes who work each week to put this together, and I would love to show you their faces. So 1 second here while I get them pulled up. So these fantastic people put in all of their time and efforts on a volunteer basis to make this happen each week, from things like organizing speakers to our YouTube and our podcast channels to Echo Factory, who sponsors us as well. I'd also like to thank you, our attendees. I know you come out for us each week, and we are so grateful for you to come on this journey with us as well. If you've missed some of our sessions, you can always check those out on our YouTube channel. And then a few logistical things for today. For Q&A, we will be doing Q&A via the Zoom meeting in the Q&A panel, which is in the bottom center of your panel. Although we have the chat window open, we will not be moderating it today. So make sure and put your questions into the Q&A panel. And then after Enrique speaks this morning, I will go ahead and aggregate some of those. We might not be able to get to all of them, but if you have additional questions, Enrique has generously agreed to stay on for a little bit and have some additional networking and Q&A after the session. So if you would like to stay for that, please stay on the line. I will stop the recording as well as the live streaming. So there'll be a little gap after we finish Q&A until we go into open networking. And at that point, we will bring you over from the attendee pool into the panelist pool, where you will be able to use your camera and be able to speak and get to know one another and ask further questions. Today, I have a few things that I want to go over this morning. I'm going to read a bit of Enrique's very illustrious bio, and then show a short presentation, a short video of some of his work for those of you who might not be familiar to his amazing work. So Enrique Martínez Celaya is an artist, author, and former scientist whose work has been exhibited and collected by major institutions around the world. And he is the author of books and papers in art, poetry, philosophy, and physics. His work is held in over 50 public collections internationally, amongst them the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Moderna Museet in Stockholm. He has created projects and exhibitions for the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and the Museum der Bildenden Kunst, among many others, as well as for institutions customarily outside of the art world, including the Berliner Philharmonie, the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine in New York, and the Dorthenstadt Cemetery in Berlin. Martínez Celaya is the first person to hold the Provost Professor of Humanities and Arts at the University of Southern California. He is also the first Visual Arts Fellow of the Los Angeles Institute, the first Visual Arts Fellow at the Huntington Museum, Library, and Botanical Gardens. He is a Fellow of the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities, the first Visual Arts Fellow of the Robertson Jeffers Torhouse Foundation, and a Montgomery Fellow at Dartmouth College, where he is also a Roth Distinguished Visiting Scholar. He has received his degrees from Cornell University, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, Santa Barbara in physics and art. I am so fascinated by this type of polymath. He is going to be speaking to us today about his work, his life in exile, unexpected career turns, how mentorship has helped him, the value of thinking outside of the box, and the validity of truth. So we have some big discussions happening today. And before I hand it over to him, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and give you a brief video to highlight his work. Welcome, Enrique. We are so pleased to have you here with us this morning. Thank you for sharing your time and some of your work with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here, be able to speak with you today. Looking forward to it.
Wonderful. All right, I'm going to go ahead and step away, and I will let you go ahead. I'm here if you need anything.
Thank you. So again, I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you today this way. I'm going to do a different kind of talk than the one I usually give related to my work. Today, I'm going to focus a little bit more on questions that may be interesting to those of you who are thinking of innovation, creativity, and discovery. So I'm going to talk about aspects of my life, career, and choices that I think may be relevant to some of you who are having questions about how to innovate or how to create something new, how to follow your own standards and discover what those are. So first, let me give you a brief overview. You saw that video of who I am. So I'm an artist who also writes, and I create environments. And by environments, I mean installations that are conceived as a conceptual unity for galleries and museums around the world. Usually those installations begin as writings that I do, and then they take the form of paintings, sculptures, occasionally videos and photographs as well. Unlike many artists, and particularly painters, I don't try to follow a particular look to things. My works are not usually unified visually, but rather conceptually. I'd rather to have a philosophical or an emotionally through line to an exhibition. And it's that emotional through line that I spent a lot of time working on in preparation for the exhibition and while developing it. At the beginning of my interest as an artist, I began painting and drawing very early and became an apprentice for a painter when I was 11. And my interest in art then is almost identical to my interest in art today, which I don't know what it says about my evolution as an artist, but perhaps consistency of preoccupation. And the consistency of preoccupation, the thing that have really mattered to me throughout the whole time is, what is this world? Who are we? What am I in it? And how do I make choices? How do we make choices? So those have been my interests, and partly why I have those interests is because early on in my life, I noticed that people were moving through life as if they knew what was going on. And I really didn't. I felt like I had so many questions and so many doubts that I wanted to address them. So I addressed them first through art, then through philosophy and literature, and then through physics. So I created, my studio is in Culver City, and I want to say just a couple of words about it because it's relevant to what we're going to talk about today. So my studio, for example, I have designed it as a support, a machine almost, a support for the ideas that I think are relevant and important. So rather than the studio, the space I work is being a collection of my affectations and my taste and a history of preferences, which is always backward looking, I'm trying to create a studio that encourages forward-looking thinking, that demands from me to be a certain kind of artist. So there are reminders throughout my studio of what matters to me, just in case that the temptations of the art world or the temptations of daily life detour me away from what I think is important. So the studio is more than just a place to work, and it's certainly not a factory. The studio is a moral and ethical demand on how to be in the world. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my exile because I think it's relevant to the work I make and to some of the other things I'm going to do. I'm going to start by sharing a screen here of when I was younger and talk about that. So when I was born in Cuba, my parents decided to leave, and we became exiled when I was 7. We took an Iberia plane one day just like any other, but a day that was completely different than anything to follow, and which determined our lives in a way that there was a before and an after. And forever, from that moment on, our past history became a history of memory, a history of stories, rather than being an actual living place. So we arrived in Spain, and I lived in Spain for several years. And then we moved to Puerto Rico, and I came here for college and graduate school. The reason why that exile is relevant to our conversation today is because, like most exiles, there is a process of reinvention that comes once you have left your country. You're in search for home, but the home is not just a house. The home is also a place to dwell, a place to define oneself a certain way. And as an exile, there's a lot of imagination that comes with that. Let's call that exilic imagination, the idea that you are going to somehow redeem that exit, redeem that history. And that aspect of evolution and redemption and trying to find a better place is a defining aspect to exiles, a defining aspect to my practice. I was very lucky that I knew early on of the importance of finding assistance in the search of the things that I was looking for. And one of those assistants that I looked for were in books. Early on, I was so clueless about who I was and what I was and moving from country to country. So I read all the time to try to understand models, to try to understand how to be, how to shape a life. So I looked for books, and soon thereafter, I began to really consciously and unconsciously look for mentors. There is a tendency to think of artists as very individualistic people, that everything that we have done ourselves. But in fact, artists, like scientists and anyone who is trying to achieve something that depends on a history or on a tradition, really can't claim that individualistic sense, because ultimately we'd rely on everything that has come before. We'd rely on parents, on teachers, and the many people that contribute to our life. And sometimes we underestimate that. So in my case, in addition to having books as mentors, I was very lucky to have found mentorship in people. And in particular, I'm going to tell you about one person who changed my life, and that was my high school principal when I was in 7th grade of the school I went to. I went to a school that was very distinguished, but I myself, was still trying to sort things out. We had just arrived in Puerto Rico from Spain, and there was some bullying going on. And one day I just brought a knife to kill one of the kids that was bullying me. Partly out of desperation, I didn't know what else to do. And I was kind of a nerdy, studious kid, so it was an unexpected choice, as you can imagine. And that same day, my high school principal was walking around the rooms, and he spoke to us about teenagers and challenges and middle school and all of that. And I saw in him, I recognized in him, an opportunity. And that afternoon, I went and talked to him, gave him the knife, and that shaped a relationship that lasted 6 years. That was life-changing for me. And I think the reason I bring this example is because quite often that recognition of what we need, that recognition of what we need to develop or what our lack may be, is very important. And trying to find the books or the people who can make a difference is critical for our development. For me, I think that since that time, I have been very fortunate to have wonderful mentors in the art world, in my life, in philosophy, in science. And I have always been good at not being passive and just waiting. I have had a reasonable awareness of my lacks and my deficiencies. And I have understood that the only way to compensate or to overcome some of those deficiencies and lacks has been by taking the personal responsibility of finding a mentor or a guide at the right time. A case in point, for instance, is I began, even though I had done painting and writing and philosophy as in high school, I also loved math and science. So I decided to be a physicist, and I went to college. I went to Cornell to be a physicist. I worked at the nuclear accelerator as an undergraduate, and that was my dream, originally to be a nuclear scientist, and that evolved into being a laser scientist. I worked at Brookhaven National Laboratory immediately upon graduating, and I did my research there while going to grad school in Berkeley to do my doctorate in physics. So physics was very important, and one of the reasons why physics was very important to me is because I was interested in understanding the world. Just like I'm interested in understanding the world through art or through philosophy, I also wanted to understand what is this world that we're looking at. And math and physics are elegant, beautiful, and exciting. So I pursued my career in physics. I was very excited. I kept painting on the side, but I always thought it would be a hobby. But once I had passed my doctoral exams and I was working on my dissertation, I realized that even though I love physics, my lifelong passion, if we want to call it that, or the thing that I felt was most critical for me to be doing was art. And the reason is simple. We tend to think of art as a luxury and art as a necessity. But in my own personal life, I felt it was a luxury to live all the questions that I have about my life and the choices I made in the door on the outside of the door of the lab, and coming to the lab just as a mind, just as a physicist, and I was going to do that for the next 50 years. I thought that there was an urgency to the questions I had that couldn't wait for, for whenever I had spare time. Because for those of you who are scientists or in technology, you probably know the fact that as a physicist, I would go 2 months without having an opportunity to think about much other than physics, because the research is very intense. So I have this, I'm going to share my screen here again to show you an image. So this is an image of me working at Brookhaven, where I was designing a femtosecond laser that we were going to use for sampling. And then at some point while doing this research, I went to a moment of crisis and I realized that I need to make a choice between painting all the time, doing physics, and I felt very split. At this point in my life, all these multiple interests feel great, and I feel very fortunate to be interested in everything, or not in everything, but in a lot of things. But back then, it really was a crisis of identity. I wasn't sure who I was, and all my friends at Berkeley were completely convinced they wanted to be physicists, and when I talked to artists, they were convinced they wanted to be artists, and here I was in this dilemma. So in November of 1990, instead of driving to the lab, I drove to a lighthouse in Northern California called Pigeon Point. And for 5 days, I stayed in that lighthouse, working and thinking and writing. And after I came out of that lighthouse, I had made the decision that I would leave physics. So it was a very challenging time. It was a very difficult time, but it was also a wonderful time to find what I thought was important to me. And it's sort of one of the things that I want to sort of to close up this little part of the presentation, this short part of the presentation, is that the thing that I learned in that week that I was writing there at the lighthouse about myself, which connects to all the mentors I have been fortunate to have, to everything I have read, is the importance of having standards, being clear about them, and what truth is for you. For me, and I think you probably find it to be the case for you too, life and the choices we make are not, there's nothing easy about it. And we get pulled in all directions, especially at this moment we have this interconnectivity and information is coming to us constantly. And how we determine what's important and what's not important was always hard, and I think it's becoming harder. There's a lot of claims about value, which makes it very difficult for us to determine what value is for us. So I have always understood that the most important job that I have in my life have been to determine what my standards are, or what truth is for me. I think if you have a beacon or a guide somewhere, you are able to navigate very rocky shores. And I have felt before, and I feel today, that the critical aspect, the primary work I do as an artist, primary work I did as a scientist, and as a human being, is to make sure that I'm clear about what my standards are. But for those of you who are involved in innovation and discovery and trying to see what else is new and having breakthroughs, those standards, having very high standards and being clear about them, doesn't mean that you have a dogmatic understanding of your own vision of yourself. For me, I think it's really important to have a clear understanding of what my standards are, what quality is, what I'm aiming towards, what examples of greatness is, so I don't get confused when people tell me something very simplistic or very superficial is great. I know that it isn't, because I know what great things are. But I'm also willing, and constantly in my work, I am willing to challenge it and change it and find new ways to think out of the box, particularly my own box. You know, we like to think of ourselves as thinking out of the box, or we challenge or become contrarian to what society is doing or what people are telling you. But quite often we're quite within a box in ourselves. And I find that that's sometimes the case with me as well. So I try to always push against what's comfortable for me. I prefer to go in the direction of my fear. And whenever I encounter resistance in myself towards a direction, I usually go exactly in that direction, because I find that there's something to be discovered there. I like to be uncomfortable, be a moving target to myself, I take myself seriously, and I take my efforts very seriously, but I am never convinced that at any moment that that's the end, and therefore I'm always pushing, always challenging myself. And I have in my studio all kinds of reminders to do that. And those reminders, again, take the form of people who I admire, ideas that I respect, that encourage me to go farther than I have gone before. And particularly farther, not in terms of accomplishments in the world, but farther in terms of my own willingness to surprise myself, my own willingness to accept that I was wrong in something that I was doing. So perhaps we're close to the time that I was talking like this, and now perhaps I'm looking forward to have your questions now, which I'm sure will be a lot more interesting than what I have been saying.
Thank you so much, Enrique, for sharing part of your story, for being authentic and vulnerable with us. I'm so grateful. We do have a few questions. Before we get started on those questions, I just wanted to ask you, after you finished at the Lighthouse and you made that decision, it's a huge decision. What do you feel like was in you, or did you ever look back and question that, or what kept you along that path till this day?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So it's not as smooth as I make it sound. So I came back from that Lighthouse, and then I had to unravel my life as a scientist. And it was as a scientist that I had any accomplishments to speak of. It was as a scientist that I have awards or recognition, and nothing as an artist. So then I have to come to terms with the disappointment of everybody, including my parents and advisors and so on. So, but what kept me in the path, and it was a very difficult one, because when I moved to Oakland to a studio that was flea infested, all my work in the parks, it was not glamorous. It may sound glamorous in retelling, but it wasn't at the time. So I think the only thing that kept me in the path and kept me going in moments that were very difficult is the conviction that that it was the right thing, and that I had to see it play itself out. I always thought maybe it will run itself out maybe in 5 years, Maybe in 5 years I would change my mind, and that would be okay. I would finish my doctorate and work as a scientist again. But I never did. And I have many doubts that I will have any success as an artist. Those remain for a long time, but I was okay with that. When I made the decision to be an artist, I was okay with the idea of having no success, which for an immigrant, for many of us, not just immigrants, but certainly for an exile, firstborn to a family, accepting that you might not be successful or you might be starving for the rest of your life wasn't easy.
Thank you for that. Is there any aspect of Cuban culture, from idiosyncrasy to arts, that has directly influenced you?
I mean, I think that Cubans in general, and particularly Cubans that have exiled and lived in many countries under very difficult conditions, tend to be very resilient. And I think that has served me well. Also, there's a tendency in the culture as a whole to value family and to value education, and are two things that I have also relied on quite often. My family has been, particularly my brothers, have been there for me in very challenging times. So that's it. That being said, sort of because I've traveled to all these countries, educated here, have interest in literature from around the world and not from around the world, I am a Cuban who is not particularly easily thought of as a Cuban artist because my work doesn't quite fit whatever stereotypes of ideas people have, but definitely the emotional basis for it owes a lot to my Cuban heritage.
As in the beginning, you talked a little bit about your, as you're finding your track. Can you talk about how as you're going forward, how you're getting off track if you do get off track? Kind of that experience of understanding, okay, wait, I'm not going in the direction I want to go. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So sometimes the only way that we're going off track or that we have gone too far is to go off track and go too far. Because if we do not push it to that level, then the alternative is to be extremely careful and conservative in our choices and being reasonable. And reasonableness is quite often the enemy of discovery and innovation and self-challenge. I think everybody's always advising everyone, especially when you're taking a big step, to be reasonable. But sometimes reasonable is another word for cowardice, to not take challenges. So I find that when I get back, of course, I look at the guides I have in terms of books, in terms of thinkers I admire, in terms of the voice of the mentors I've had, and those standards always bring me back online and help me remember what matters. And that's why I think one of the critical aspects for anyone is to develop those standards and those things that bring you back. And I like to think of them as a lighthouse, that no matter how rocky things are, you always know where the shore is, you always know where to go. I mean, when things are difficult, I always go back to those things.
What about the nature of painting is significant as a vehicle for your intellectual concerns?
So the way I approach painting, I'm approach painting as a search for meaning and a creation of meaning. So I'm very interested in painting not as a verb, which is things you do to paintings. People talk about gestures and so on. I like to think of painting as a noun, as a way of thinking through things. So painting the relationship of images, references, and the presence of the thing itself, the embodiment of those ideas into something physical. the push of the material against the ideas. All of that helps me think through things in a way that, say, philosophy, while very exciting mentally, doesn't have a physical component in that sense. And it's that wrestling with the embodiment of something, that wrestling with the presence and charge of the object itself and its push against ideas and references and memory that creates a perfect alchemy for me. So like if I start thinking of paintings without ever doing them, I start to float into space a little bit. And I think always in the process of making, the actual doing something with my hands, I get grounded. And then that grounding allows those ideas to then resonate in a different way than when they're just in my head.
Very interesting, the process. We have a question from one of our attendees in London. He said, you mentioned the interconnectivity that we have today. With that in mind and the present day level of communication, how do you think you would go about making your Pigeon Point decision today? Where would you go? Would you have to completely disconnect in order to make that decision? What is your 2021 Pigeon Point? I know that's a number of questions, but I'll let you kind of pick and choose where you want to go with that.
Yeah, I mean, back then, I only knew of one lighthouse, one place that will be willing to house me and that I can escape for myself. Now the tendency now is to look at 27 different choices online and be able to see an app that tells me where to go. What's the right place to change your career? So those are the advantage of today, is that we have all these ways to gather information and learn a lot of things about things that in 1990 were not accessible. On the other hand, there is a tendency for many of us to be frozen by the amount of information. We become only consumers of information rather than people capable of generating actions. So I think that the wonderful thing about today is that access, and it's also the challenges of today is that access. And during those 5 days, I didn't look at my cell phone at all and see who was trying to reach me or anything like that, because in 1990 there was not a cell phone. So the capacity to be removed from my life entirely in a lighthouse and contend with what this decision meant for me, for my family, for my advisors, without any interruption, without any tendency to look at what Instagram was posting and so on, was a gift. And I think the challenges for us today is to figure out how we can create these moments where we can have the mental space required to make some decisions or to think about some problems, while at the same time taking advantage of the offerings that technology and connectivity and information provides. And I think that is a very difficult equilibrium to achieve for many people. And it's a new problem, I think, that we didn't have 30 years ago.
What are the ways you keep yourself uncomfortable? Is it a conscious decision to move out of comfortability or an unconscious act?
The first part of that is to make sure that we don't pretend. There's a lot of tendencies for people to talk about failure or discomfort or go in the direction of your fears. That is sometimes somewhat decorative, just kind of superficial, and it's mostly intended to be something that we speak about, but not truly live deeply with. So I am trying to make sure that when I'm challenging myself and trying to be uncomfortable, it's not just on the surface. I'm trying to go to the foundations of my thinking as well as I can. And my main tool is really a combination of introspection with those standards that I spoke about. I mean, if I think that I am really challenging myself as a writer, I might read Hemingway and look at Hemingway's writing and realize that in fact, I can see all my lies in my writing, and in fact that I am just a poser, a hack in comparison. Or I might look at the beautiful poems of Miguel Hernandez and come to the same conclusion. So look at the paintings of Manet and think about myself in relationship to that and see how far I am from any real breakthroughs. And those things, rather than discourage me and put me into a heap of sadness because I'm not there, and let me know that more is possible, that I have to, that my assumptions and everything that I hold dear must not be perfect, otherwise I will be there. So then I begin to shake things up, begin to be willing to abandon and give up things that I am holding on very tightly and that I really feel that they define me. Well, who will I be without this thing? Who will I be without that thing? And the answer sometimes is maybe you'll be something better if you were to give this or that.
How do you find your mentors?
I think you find mentors. Like I have had two kinds of mentors. One is books, and I consider some of those mentors. For example, what Nietzsche was to me in my teenage years was a mentor. It was like a friend that sat around and told me some things. I have found many of those book mentors. Hermann Hesse's writing when I was 14 and 15 were life-changing to me. And I would think, well, Hesse was a mentor to me, even though he was dead. So I have had those mentors, and I continue to have those mentors. And then the real life mentors come the same way we find friends. You don't ask somebody to be my mentor. You look at someone, you recognize in them, just like we recognize in someone the possibility of a friendship. You recognize in someone something that is useful, something that is meaningful, something that you can learn from, somebody who is living life in a way that is worth of admiration. And then you try to create a little space for yourself in their lives. Whatever it is, a great mentor doesn't have to talk to you about science or art. Maybe sometimes just sitting with each other and watch how that person eats their meal, how they fold their napkin is already a good mentorship. How people move through life, I think, is the biggest example I have gotten from my mentors. And from time to time, they drop a little lesson or a way of being that I treasure. So to answer the question more properly, keeping your eyes open, knowing who can be of guidance to you, and not be selfish in that. I mean, I think sometimes people really want to take and take and take. Sometimes, how can you be of assistance to somebody and learn from them in the process of serving them? Is sometimes a good way to find a mentor.
I love that. I feel like most of the things I've learned from mentors as well is that observation, just seeing how they move and act and speak. And I find that really inspiring. We have a lot of questions left, but we're gonna wrap up. We are gonna go to open networking. But before we leave, I have a couple questions. One is, what's inspiring you today?
It's always a long list, but I think, well, in a very practical sense, I have a number of writings that I've been doing for a long time that are really making me recruit new ideas. And I'm inspired by the questions of how are we in the world now today. I feel that this is a moment that is full of possibilities, but also full of dangers. And I'm trying to ask the questions: what are those dangers and what are those possibilities? And I'm inspired by these questions. I'm inspired by the question of how can we be something today, and what does that question even mean? So I think I feel the certain urgency of this moment between the conditions that we have, whether it's the climate conditions or the political conditions or the personal conditions, the information situation we're dealing with, the multiplicity of offerings that is making choices increasingly difficult, and it's making us move very laterally rather than vertically. And I'm trying to ask questions of myself in that. And that is, to me, inspiring, daunting, but I don't mind that it's daunting. It's also inspiring.
Did this bring up anything else you'd love to share with us before we kind of transition to the next piece in our event?
Well, I would like to just say in concluding this part that, you know, when in talking about standards or talking about mentors or talking about choices that we make, you know, I think we tend to see those things as intimidating, and they were to me, and they still are to me sometimes when I confront a new path. When I was doing research, the discovering of something in physics felt very, very at times stressful. I might be able to resolve this problem, but it is also gives so much meaning to our lives. I think that one of our crises today is a crisis of meaning, because I think we are quite often concerned with happiness at the moment. And that happiness at the moment is often quite hollow. And I think that behind everything I'm saying is the question of meaning. How do you find meaning in your life? How do you find meaning in your choices? How do you find meaning in your career, your investigations, your work? And that the work of finding meaning for yourself, creating meaning in your life, I would say that is the principal work that we have to do as human beings. How do we make life meaningful? And when we're talking about mentors or the work we do, that ultimately reduces to that. How do we make our life meaningful and our actions meaningful? So I think I would like to just end with that, maybe.
Well, you ended on a very powerful note. Thank you for sharing that. We want to thank Enrique and his team for being here this morning and sharing with us very authentically. We're grateful to him. And we are going to meet again on February 5th. We were going to be hearing from Joel Eifel. He's the CEO of Dash, and he's going to be speaking about what his startup has learned delivering humanitarian aid in hurricanes. So it's a different twist, but we're looking forward to meeting with Joel and learning from him as well. In the meantime, stay safe and well. For those of you staying on the line, just stay there. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the Zoom and the recording, and we will move you over. Thank you, everyone.